All right. Hey, everybody. Hello, Paw Pawers. This is the live session for the Love of Paw Paws for the session number 3, where we dove into talking about germinating your seeds and grafting. Hopefully, everyone's had a chance to watch that. And feel free to fire me up with questions on that or just in general. This is your time. So whatever your curiosity is, let it fly. I did receive a couple of queries via the course. One was actually a good question I've never heard before, which was, do pawpaw leaves have an allelopathic effect on other things near them? Allelopathic basically it's like black walnuts. They excrete a certain chemical that inhibits other things to grow around them. And since pawpaws, leaves and twigs do have acetogenins in them, which is sort of a natural insecticide property to them, it's a good question, but no. I, in my experience, have never seen the pawpaw leaves have an allelopathic or sort of a prohibitive effect on any other plants around them. So I would not worry about that. So yeah, answers that question. All right, Annie, let's see. I wonder about how much a taproot can be disturbed. As in, can the tree survive if the taproot gets cut off? All right, good question. The pawpaw does not like to have its taproot messed with at all. It can regenerate, yes. It kind of depends on what age and stage that you're disturbing that root at. Are you digging it up? Is that what you're doing? Can you give me a little bit more information? I can maybe dial it in for you a little better. This is some of that Paul Stamets hot chocolate with mushrooms in it. Good stuff for this weather. So, depending. So for your taproot, if it does get broken, it will probably send out more what we call feeder roots. So more lateral roots, more fine hair roots to kind of start to compensate for the lack of that taproot to start with. And then once it has enough nutrients it's able to absorb through those feeder roots, it'll start to regrow the taproot. So it will want to regrow that. Let's see. When transplanted, its taproot had been hanging out of the hole at the bottom and it got nicked. So if it just got nicked, if it's just the bottom, I would say you're probably fine, for it regenerating. I would go ahead and give it like a good compost tea feeding. When you do like a liquid compost, it's really easily absorbed by the plant. So it helps with some of that transplant shock. A lot of times people will use sort of a fish emulsion or a seaweed, like a liquid seaweed or kelp. And you can kind of make your own concoctions and drench your recently transplanted tree. Some people will actually do a soak. They'll take the tree roots and they'll soak it in that before they plant it. But do be mindful. I had this happen a couple of times when I used fish emulsion. That things came and dug it up. The raccoons around here, even a bear came into my nursery once when I used a fish emulsion as sort of a liquid fertilizer, came in and I knew it was a bear because these big, 14-inch deep tree pots were thrown all over the place. So the bear had come in and just like started chucking and looking for like the fish basically. So keep that in mind. Otherwise just use like a seaweed fish emulsion. In the session that's coming out next week, in the session 4, where we're talking about planting and caring for your pawpaw trees, I do talk about making your own liquid compost teas with things like comfrey and nettles, and even your own urine. So you can make your own, but at this time of year, there may not be a lot to gather for that. So just love it up with some liquid fertilizer, because even after the leaves fall on your tree, your roots are still going to be active. As long as that soil is still warm, they're going to start, they're going to start sort of reestablishing themselves in that new location. So just because the leaves are gone doesn't mean that the tree is completely dormant. Okay, thank you for the advice and the bear story. I have raccoons. Yeah, you gotta be careful with those critters. Sometimes even if I put down compost that's still got a little bit of undigested scraps and stuff, they'll dig around in that and tear stuff up. So I've learned the hard way to be more mindful of those critters. All right, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of questions coming in. Another question I did get on email was about the mature trees that I show in the first session of the course. We have these beautiful full-sized and full sun pawpaw tree that's a good 20, 25 years old. And it has a beautiful pyramid shaped tree to it. And the question was, is that natural or did I prune it? And that's natural. So if you have a pawpaw tree that's growing in full sun, it will take on a beautiful pyramid shaped tree. Now, of course, if it's partial light, partial sun, it'll get leggy. And then if it's in the deeper shade of the woods, it's going to be probably more of a patch, more of like a spread out shrub bush, and not that beautiful pyramid shape. And also in the session that's going to come out, fourth session next week, just after Thanksgiving, is I do talk about pruning and shaping your trees, and how even if you do, cut your trees, to keep them at 8 or 10 feet tall, which I do recommend, they will quickly close that space back up in the same growing season, and you'll have a very beautiful looking little small pyramid shaped tree. Hey, Ron, good evening to you. Just curious if I've ever attempted to graft multiple cultivars on the same tree. Yes, I am a grafting ninja, and I love to multi-graft stuff, though it typically comes back to sort of bite me in the ass, because then I've got like, which I got to try and keep track of, which is which on a tree. But yes, you can do it very easily. Paw Paws graft very easily. And I cover that too in session 4, which will be coming your way soon. And I graft outdoors, what we call site grafting. And Paw Paws, the graft unions heal quite easily and readily. And you can't say that for all types of fruits and nut trees, but Paw Paws do graft very easily. And a lot of times, if you have a young pawpaw that's coming up and it has a couple of main scaffold branches, you can graft each one of those. I mean, you can graft multiples. I have one out there. I have a Tetu and a Shenandoah on one of my trees. But again, then you've got to try and, keep track of what's what. But it's a good space saver. So if you've got a small yard and you've only got space for one tree, it's a great option for getting that cross-pollination needs in. But sure, you could graft as many as the tree, as many of those branches as creates a nice spread out canopy for you. Okay, Ross. Several years ago, I planted lots of seed and now have many seedlings. Well, congratulations. I have no idea what the varieties were. Is it possible to tell them from the leaves, or can you only tell from the fruit? Well, cultivars, variety, the term variety gets used a lot. It's slightly misused. Variety is more of a major variation within a species. A cultivar is a selection. Anyway, small thing there, but I know what you mean. So you're talking about seedlings. Within cultivars, you potentially could tell a couple of them from the leaves. Susquehanna is a good example. Susquehanna has almost like a quilted. It has like a pattern to its leaf that is unique. Things like Davis and NC1, they have a very ornamental sort of large leaf. But man, you'd have to be a super ninja to be able to like really distinguish, a cultivar by its leaf. So I'm going to err and say that no, you're not really going to probably find out by the leaf. Now, the fruit is probably going to be your better bet. Since it's a seedling, it's not going to be just one of its parents. So even if that seed came from, say, Allegheny, it's going to be Allegheny is going to be one parent, and then it's going to have a different parent, another tree nearby. So it's going to have mixed characteristics in it. So, I don't know if that answered your question. So if your seeds were from cultivars, if you knew that you got your seeds from really good genetics and good trees, they're what are now called select seedlings. So if you know that the trees you got them from were only cultivars and they didn't cross-pollinate with anything wild, then they are select seedlings. They have good genetics, even though you can't call them, by the name of one of their parents, because that would mean it's a clone, it's an exact replica. Since it's going to have two different parents, but those two parents have, are both cultivars of really good genes, then you can call that a select seedling. I call the seeds I grow from my cultivars Mike's select seedlings, and I sell them on my nursery. And people buying those know that they're going to have good genetics, but they're not a Pacific name. Now, if I was more organized, and some other people are more organized, they might note the parent. So let's say I took a seed from an Allegheny fruit and I grew it out as a seed. I could say that, hey, one of the parents of this is Allegheny. The other, I'm not sure, unless I went out there and hand pollinated very carefully and did a control pollination. Then I could say, hey, this is Allegheny and Shenandoah. I know the two parents, but typically cross-pollination is happening naturally. So, you're just going to have to call them select seedlings. All right. They were farmer market fruit. I would have to see if the farmer knows, but chances are slim. Yeah, that's tricky. That's why it's always really good when you get a Paw Paw, whether you buy a Paw Paw seedling or you're getting seeds, is to really find out as much as you can about that from whoever's selling it. And typically, if you're buying a seedling and someone can't tell you that, I would probably not buy it. So like if you go to the nursery and they're like, oh yeah, we've got native Paw Paws. And it's like, okay, well, do you know where those seeds are from? And they're like, no. Then it could be someone who collected them wild. It could be a small, dinky, seedy fruit. And so it's not really, worth your time and effort unless you're going to graft it. But even if you're going to graft onto a seedling, it's still ideal that the rootstock is a select seedling because, when your graft dies, and that may be 20, 30 years, it'll send up new shoots. And those new shoots will be from the rootstock. So if it's select, you're fine. You still got good genetics in there. But if it's a wild one, then you're what was once, a delicious cultivar is going to turn into something, wild and seedy. And Paw Paw roots can live potentially for hundreds of years. What they'll do is they'll just send up their shoots, that might live, let's say 25, 30 years as your Paw Paw tree. But then if that dies, then it's going to send up more shoots. That root system can live for hundreds of years. Some people are speculating, there's some Paw Paw root systems that are more than 1,000 years old, right? So ideally, you're getting select seedlings as your understock. But if it is wild and you've grafted onto it, there could potentially be some benefit that wild stock is really tough, is super well adapted to your region. Maybe it's developed in your region, for thousands, maybe millions of years. Whereas that select seed might have come from a totally different region, and it will probably, maybe it only does fair in your zone because it's not quite as acclimated to your set of regional climatic realities. So Jim Davis, who's a friend of mine, has the oldest, largest commercial Paw Paw orchard in the world. And most of his stock is grafted onto wild Paw Paws. And he attributes, a lot of their resistance and resilience to drought and other things to that wild stock. So anyway, nuances there. All right, let's see. Off-base question. I ask horticultural folks these days, do you know about effects of jumping worms on plant growth, such as Paw Paws? You got me there. Jumping worms. Are those like, yeah, I guess I know they're up in New England a lot. I think I've been reading on some of the forums about them. And I don't know. I've not had that issue here. I've not seen other people sort of in the Paw Paw world saying, hey, we're having issues with our Paw Paws because of these jumping worms. You could post it on Paw Paw Fanatics. That's a Facebook group that is full of fanatics, but there are a lot of people with a lot of experience in there. Everyone has their own style of growing, so I don't necessarily, agree with everything everybody's doing there, but you could probably get some good feedback on some of these variants. All right. You mentioned you will be covering pruning next session. Yes. I have limited space in one area of my property that was hoping to trim them into a controlled Paw Paw patch type hedge about 10 feet tall. Yeah, no problem. I keep my trees at about 8 or 10 feet. I want to be able to reach in and hand pick all of my fruits. If I'm getting Paw Paw webworms in August, which I also talk about in the next session, I want to be able to reach up into the top of that tree and easily get them. I want to be able to reach my fruit. And so, yes, I talk about that in there, your spacing for your Paw Paws. I mean, if you wanted to get extreme with it, you could do your Paw Paws at 8 feet spacing, but that's going to take a lot of attention, and you're going to have to make sure that your lateral branches are consistently back to 3 to 4 feet. They're almost nubs, and that's how Jim Davis does his orchard. I tend to let mine go more 4 to 5 feet. But I think 4 feet is probably a good length to go to on your trees. But then you want to be able to maneuver around your trees. Paw Paw branches are brittle, and if you're going in there during harvest season and you're really having to like knock around in your trees, you're likely to be damaging and breaking up the branches. Airflow is important. I talk about phylosticta, one of the fungal issues on Paw Paws in session 4. And one of the main ways to balance that's making sure you have airflow. So yes, you can put them into a small area and you can prune them intensively, almost, 8 feet tall, 4 feet in width, branch width. So yes, more on that in the next session. They are in Maryland. Hope you don't get them, the jumping worms. Well, whenever something new shows up on our scene, I look at what's adaptive. And if for some reason, with the changing climate patterns and realities that we're coming into, if something like the Paw Paw, hard to imagine, was adversely effective, then I would move on. I would start working with those species that are adapting. We're in an extinction period. So it's like, who is adapting, and I'd move with those species more and more. That's why, I work with autumn olives. They're medicinal, and they're nitrogen fixers, they're soil builders. A lot of people are going to, scream and cry about them being invasive and stuff, but they are adapting to the changing climate. So I'm observing those things. As a permaculturist, I'm constantly unbiasedly observing what's going on, and I'm moving with the flow. Right now, and historically, the Paw Paws are doing really well in our region. So I'm going to work with that, but I'm not going to stick with anything that's not naturally flowing forward. I hope that makes sense. I planted my seedlings a little close together in this area, just about 8 feet apart. You can make that work. Yeah, 8 feet. I've got a few trees that are 8 feet apart now. But again, just maintain your lateral branches so that you're not getting rubbing. You don't want branches to rub each other within the same tree or on neighboring trees. That rubbing then creates, opportunities for insects and disease to get in there. So you can totally keep your branches, like I say, between 3 and 4 feet. So that kind of spacing will work. You just got to keep on top of it. if you, I like to design for neglect, because, if you stop doing that, they're going to really sort of bush into each other, and that's going to start shading them, which will reduce some of your fruit buds and your fruit set, and it'll create less airflow and potential for more fungal issues and diseases. But you keep on top of it, man, you'll be able to do really well with that spacing. Okay. I planted Susquehanna, awesome, Allegheny, and PA Golden along my driveway. Do they grow about the same rate, height, etc., or will I need to trim more of them more often? That's a good question. There is some variation in vigor in some of the trees. I've noticed Potomac to be a super vigorous grower. Mango is also a super vigorous grower. PA Golden, I find to potentially have, slightly smaller leaves. And it's almost got, more of that sort of unselected wild character in it, which can have its benefits. It's a smaller fruit, which can also have its benefits. Some of these big fruits get issues sometimes when they're splitting. So Allegheny and PA Golden having a smaller size fruit can actually be a boon, a benefit to it. Um, you know, but I would say more likely the variations in some of the different pawpaw trees that you might have are more likely to come from the soil and the site conditions that they're in. Now, if they're all the exact same site and soil conditions, then you've got a good opportunity for observation on those. But typically, there's going to be variation on our site. We've got 3 acres of food forests and lots of different. They're almost all that's in full sun. But in different areas, I'm going to get different growth out of say my pawpaw trees based on how much available moisture. Is it more intense sun where they're at? Do they have any root competition from something else? So there's going to be more of those variations in my growth. So yeah, hopefully that gives you something to go with. Just mulch the heck out of them, man. Especially along your driveway, they'll appreciate the extra warmth and heat. But sometimes next to driveways, it can be really dry. It can be a little too dry and hot. But the pawpaws will take that as long as you've got lots of mulch for them. And you might also consider, if your driveway, if you can catch some of that water that's coming down your driveway, you can cut that off and swale it. If you can make a sort of a ditch on contour coming off your driveway above your pawpaws, and you can capture that water and get it to sink into the water table above your pawpaws, that would be a huge boon. We're gonna talk more about that, especially in the final session when we get into pawpaws and permaculture. I'm going to talk more about how to use swales and hugelkultur beds and what we call passive water harvesting designs to help augment, the available moisture for your pawpaws and help them thrive without you having to constantly consider their moisture needs. All right. Annie, my PA Golden and Sunflower had fruit first time. Awesome. Congratulations. The seeds were small and thin. If handled properly, could the seedlings have developed into a quality tree, or could they not be viable? Let me see. The seeds were small and thin. If handled properly, could the seedlings have developed into a quality tree? Not quite sure what that second part is trying to say, but it sounds like maybe your seeds aren't full and they're a little thin and they're not potentially as viable as you're hoping they would be. But size in a pawpaw seed doesn't necessarily indicate its viability. If it's super flat and thin, yes, then you might not have the food reserves in there that it's going to need, because remember, it puts down a 9-inch deep taproot before it even puts up a shoot. So all of that's happening from that seed, which is really miraculous. But I'm not quite sure what you're asking on that. The seeds were small and thin. If handled properly, could the seedlings have developed into a quality tree, or could they not be viable? That's not making sense to me. You're just going to have to grow them out and see. Go ahead and make sure that you're stratifying them in the refrigerator with plenty of, moisture, and then just go for it germinating. If you only got a handful of seeds, try and germinate them all. Me, I've got, hundreds of seeds. So, if I see any defects or something that doesn't look like it's going to be good, I'll toss it. But hey, work with what you got. Let's see. One of my questions, Ron, should I protect my trees with burlap to protect from snow blowing driveway onto them and possibly being buried? Sure. Why not? You got the time. I would love your trees up. If you get heavy snow pushing against it too much, they could easily break, and that would be the biggest concern. I wouldn't necessarily be so concerned about the cold because snow can actually act as an insulator, to things. But I just would be more concerned about, too much pressure and snapping your seedlings. So you could try anything like that would help protect too much pressure, but the snow itself shouldn't be an issue. They're only about 2 years old and maybe 3 feet tall. Yeah, I would go ahead and give them a little extra protection, again, just from the pressure of it versus anything else. Be a sad story to have them break. Though they would, even if they do break, they especially at that size, a couple years old, 3 feet tall, it sounds like they're getting well established. They should be able to reshoot either from lower on the stem or a whole new shoot altogether. All right, was concerned about protecting them. Yeah, I mean, I don't see why you wouldn't want to, give some extra care and protection to your trees if you have that time and interest. Again, designed for neglect. Make sure that you're not really going to need to be there to take care of them is ideal. But if you got the bandwidth, go for it, man. All righty. Any other questions? That was an interesting mix you guys had. I appreciate that. Keeps me on my toes. I love talking about Paw Paws, so it's good to have others to do it with. Let's see. Thank you for limiting sighting options. Victor, hello. Don't see your question. How to mitigate wind? Okay, so good question, because wind is a key factor that you need to think about with your Paw Paws. Wind will desiccate. It will dry out your leaves. It'll shred your leaves. It'll challenge your pollination. Wind and Paw Paws just do not mix well, at least strong winds like that. So I would do windbreaks automatically. And that's going to vary on where you're at. The quickest thing are willows. You can get willow rods. Check out Vermont Willow. Vermont Willow is an awesome nursery. I'm a big willow fan. I grow over 50 species of willows here. There are over 400 species of willows. Multi-purpose. Some of them are great pollinators for bees, obviously for weaving. Make your own charcoal, many uses for willows. But you can literally stick, anywhere from 1 foot cuttings into the ground to 8 to 10 foot cuttings. So, I have willow domes and willow arches here where I'll get, 8 to 12 feet of growth per year. So I have these huge whips. I'll stick them in the ground a good 10, 12 inches in the ground, and they'll start to grow if I do it the right time, which typically is the very end of winter. Then they'll start just to leaf out, and you could have an instant sort of fence in that regard. So I think Vermont Willow might sell, 8-foot rods of some of their varieties. So you could either stick the whole 8-foot rod in there, or you could cut those in half and do some 4-foot rods, depending on, how tall your Paw Paws are now and how quickly you need to protect them. So if if they're not too tall and you're eager to get that coverage in there, I would do willow cuttings, and you could put those willow cuttings, every 2 feet. And then they're going to start branching out and creating some of that windbreak for you. Obviously, you could go ahead and do something, temporary around your Paw Paws. You could do sort of welded wire So you can buy welded wire, which is basically 2-inch by 4-inch sections within a welded wire, and it comes in, you can buy it in 2-foot, 24-inch, 48-inch, et cetera, et cetera. And you can cut that and sort of, make a circle with it. It's a firm circle. And then you could go ahead and put burlap or something around that to help protect your paw paws, especially while they're young and getting up and you're waiting for your windbreaks to come in. But I would still put your windbreaks in, because in the long run, you want that wind protection. And the cool thing about these willows is most people freak out about willows because they only know the one big weeping type of willow that has a bad rap for having root systems that affect people's houses. But there's all kinds of willows. There's willows that are only like, 12 inches tall. There's bush willows. Some of the hybrid willows, if you let them go, would only get, maybe 12 feet tall. So you're not talking about these crazy vigorous things. If you did a living fence with your willows, you could cut them every year. You could cut them at whatever height you wanted. You could cut them back. You have more cuttings. You could go ahead and share those, sell those, propagate them like crazy. Literally, all you have to do is stick them in the ground. They root and grow. They're freaking awesome. Anyway, went off a little bit there, but you could also do some bush fruits. I'm a big fan of gummies. Gummy is a nitrogen-fixing shrub that's gorgeous. Produces these little sweet tart berries that are very medicinal and very tasty. So it's a fast-growing shrub, fast-producing shrub. In full sun, it might get around 8 feet tall by about 8 feet wide. And so you could, put some gummy bushes on your windward side to help create some of that windbreak that also gives you the multiple functions of having that tasty medicinal fruit and nitrogen fixation in it. So I'm a big fan of those, and they're quite cold hardy as well. All right, some people advise putting white paint on tree trunks in places with warm winters. In Virginia, would you advise painting trunks to avoid the south side of trunks getting too warm? Yes. And I cover that in session 4, which is coming out next week. So you are ahead of yourself, but it is that time of year to do it. Now, the basic recipe is indoor white latex paint diluted 50% with water. And yes, you're going to want to paint your trunks, and you can actually go up into the scaffold branches as well. And what that does is it reflects that light. So especially on the southwest side of your trees, this goes for most of your young fruit trees and trees, period, is in the wintertime, when it's got freezing weather, but during the day, you get a warm day and the bark on that southwest side warms up, it expands, but then it freezes again at night. So then it contracts, and that expansion and that contraction creates a fissure. It'll basically create a cut, and that will then, damage your tree and allow insects and disease and other issues to come. It's just not helpful to your tree. So by painting it with this white reflective paint, you're reflecting that light and you're avoiding that damage. I also, in my book, both my books, talk about recipes for a more natural reflective paint, either using like a lime wash, a natural lime, or you could use, maybe more like a natural paint. And you can mix into that like diatomaceous earth, which is basically like little sharp shards that would help keep crawling insects and things from going up. You could put some compost in there so that you're actually also kind of feeding the soil and the microbes on your tree. You could put blood meal on there. You could do sort of these additional beneficial things into that paint at the same time. Kaolin clay. Kaolin clay is a fine white clay, and that could help smother things like insects that might be overwintering on your trunk. So you can kind of get more in depth with that. But the very minimum, do your indoor white latex paint 50% protected. So good question. Yes. In Virginia, yes, I would do it. Some people will just put those twirly white tree protectors on, and that will also help and keep deer from horn rubbing on your trees. Just be sure to take those off during the growing season, because basically they create protective habitat for boring insects and things. So if you use those, only use them in the winter. All right. Planning on planting gummies. Cool. The challenge is finding gummies these days, man. I think I undid part of this in my, by talking them up so much in my books, is that now the nursery industry, it's hard to find gummies. They're selling out rapidly. So definitely get on finding them sooner than later. Check with Raintree, One Green World, and get your gummies as soon as you can. They are well worth having, and they're not easy to propagate. So that's another one of the reasons that they're not super available in the trade right now. Demand plus, being a little bit hard to propagate makes them hard to get. So, but you want them. They are awesome, awesome. Super big fan of the gummies. Okay. All right, guys. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you all. I appreciate you guys being here, and I love your feedback. Please do give me your feedback on the course, presentation, anything. I take that readily, and it can help me keep improving. As I do this course, and I'm going to be doing other courses. I got lots of courses in me, so I'm learning as I go along here, and your all's feedback is definitely appreciated. So happy Paw Pawing to you guys. Happy Thanksgiving. And we'll be seeing you soon. All right. Bye.